Okay, I think people are hopping in from the waiting room now. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to greet everybody, welcome you to this presentation on decodable text with our guest presenter, Dr. Lindsey Conner. My name is Mary Newton. I'm on the board of directors for the Reading League Wisconsin. And this evening I have my board colleague, Jeanette Russell, here with me. Before turning things over to Lindsey, I just have a few announcements. First, we are recording this meeting and we'll upload the recording to the YouTube channel of the Reading League Wisconsin, and you won't need any special link to get access to that. We also have a certificate of attendance available to anyone who's viewing this live tonight. And near the end of the hour, I'll put a link in the chat for you to request a certificate if you want one. And as questions occur to you when Lindsey is speaking, just pop your questions in the chat and Jeanette and I will keep an eye on them and kind of sort them out. And when we get near the end of the presentation, then I will have Lindsey answer as many of those questions as we have time for. I also do want to remind you that Reading League Wisconsin, all of our virtual programming during the school year is free, and you can register by going to the events page on our website, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. This coming Saturday, our Teachers Lounge is meeting at 9 a.m. We have monthly Teachers Lounge meetings. This year, our Teachers Lounge meetings are aimed at understanding and discussing the implementation of Act 20 in Wisconsin. So if you're a Wisconsin educator, it's a good chance for you to get yourself up to date and ask questions. We all have questions about what's going on with Act 20, so it's a good time to discuss that. And then finally, I want to thank Aaron's Education and La Brea Education for connecting us with Lindsey. And you may notice Lindsey looks a little fuzzy. She's in a secure location because there's a tornado watch in Missouri. So everybody keep your fingers crossed that we don't have any problems. And Lindsey, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and then to start your presentation.
Yes, thank you so much. And yeah, the sirens just went off, so I got to move locations and I'm under my house. So I apologize that my video quality is not great, but everyone is safe. So that's what's important. So I am really excited to be here and to share with you guys. I'm trying to get my screen sharing here. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
It says, oh, no, yeah, I'm not sure. It says you've started screen sharing. I just don't see it yet.
Yeah, it says it's paused. Let me see. Try to resume it. Nothing.
It's
We
nice and black.
we even tried this several times
Yes.
beforehand, but that's when I was in a
There we
normal.
go. I see
Oh,
it.
you see it now? Okay,
Now
great.
you just need to double click for that full screen view or whatever, yeah.
Perfect. Present.
It's just a little cut off. There we go. That's
You can see the
perfect.
whole thing?
Yes,
Okay.
that's very good. Thank you.
Oh, I see what's happening. It's because, okay. Okay, I think I've got it now. So yes, my name is Lindsey Conner, and I have a few different roles. During the school day, I work for Logan Rogersville School District, where my title is Elementary Literacy Specialist. So I get to support teachers and the classroom with hands-on coaching. I get to do lots of professional development and support our curriculum development as well, and just supporting the district and making sure that we're implementing best practices. I also work for La Brea and get to wear a few different hats there as well. Currently, one of the projects I'm working on is writing some nonfiction decodables for their Developing Decoders series that's aligned to the UFly text. So that has been super exciting. I've really enjoyed that, as well as doing their Science of Reading Academy. I originally taught kindergarten, first and second grade, so that's how I got into education. My first year, I taught kindergarten and very quickly realized that I did not know how to teach reading and needed to do a lot of learning. I taught in a district that had 80 to 90% of my students were EL students, and they did not speak English as their first language. So I went and got my master's degree from Missouri Southern in supporting EL students for K-12 and learned a lot about language and about literacy and really found a passion for that. Later, I moved to the Springfield area in Missouri and pursued my doctorate with Evangel University. And my doctorate research focused on structured literacy and specifically how to break down the bridge to practice gap because there is such a discrepancy between what research shows and what happens in the classroom. And there's lots and lots of layers that contribute to that. And so, really, just trying to seek out how we can break down those barriers and best support teachers, which is really what I get to do in both of these roles. So, I love it. On the screen, you can see a picture of myself and my husband. He is an eighth grade teacher and he teaches middle school ELA. So we try not to talk work all the time, but we certainly have a lot to talk about between the two of us. And then you can see my cat Pinecone as well. He is our fur baby that keeps us company in the evenings. So, just to take a moment here, if you have a scratch piece of paper around, that's perfect. Or if you want to put it in the chat, in your own words, how would you define decodable text? Mary, are you able to see the chat? Oh, there it is. I think it's hiding for me. Okay, so I see text that primarily matches the phonics relationships the student has learned. That is a great definition. I'll give you
Anybody else has ideas about what decodable text is? How you do define it? How would you explain it to a teacher if you went in and requested that they use more decodable text? How would you define that? You just drop it in the chat.
I'll give you just about 10 more seconds. Short readers with repeating patterns that help better solidify the sound symbol phonics patterns they've learned. Simple texts that help beginning readers practice reading new words using phonics patterns they've learned. So I see lots of patterns and consistencies in those definitions. Purposeful text, that's such a great way to say it. And the definition that I wanted to share with you all is from Adams in 1990. And she states that decodable books are carefully controlled books that contain phoneme grapheme correspondences matching the scope and sequence of phonics skills students are learning. So, exactly what you all were just saying. It's really matching the text that students have in their hands to skills that they have previously learned. So, making sure that our decodables align with the scope and sequence that we're using for Tier 1 instruction, as well as the high frequency words that have been taught. So I have a question. Would you consider this book to be a decodable text? It is titled A Visit to the Dentist. The first page says the dentist office. There is often a big crew working at the dentist office. When you get there, you will check in and wait for the waiting room for your turn. So just a thumbs up or thumbs down. You can stick it in the chat or just show on the screen. Do you consider this book a decodable text? Not for a beginning reader. No. I see no's. Yeah, so I kind of asked you a trick question, right? So would you consider, yes, if students have learned vowel teams and are controlled, exactly, right? So the truth is, any book can be decodable if you think through what have students been taught up to that point? What are they showing mastery of? And does the book align with that scope and sequence? So we want all books to be decodable. So just because they have the label decodable doesn't make them automatically decodable. But we want to be very intentional with the type of text that we're putting in front of our students. So this book definitely could be a decodable text, and in fact is part of the Developing Decoders by La Brea, that would be perfect for students that have learned some of those more complex vowel skills. And this particular one is going to give them lots of opportunity to practice the long U sound. Okay, so when we're thinking about today, there's really three goals. The first is to discuss the science of decodable text. The second is to discuss the joy of decodable text. Sometimes they get a bad rap, but they are really beneficial for our students and have lots of benefits. And we're going to talk about some strategies for using decodable text. So starting with the science of decodable text. So I always like to go back to the brain's reading regions because really this to me is what prevents us from being on that pendulum swing. We have research that shows us exactly what is happening in the brain when students learn to read, and we know what we need to do in order to facilitate this process. So when students are learning to read, we are retraining the brain, right? It's not a natural process. And the first area is really the occipital temporal region. And that is called the visual word form area. And that area can be specialized to distinguish letters and word shapes as well. Then there's the parietal temporal region, and that area we will see a lot of activation with our early readers who are beginning to make those connections between the written graphemes and the phonemes. So there's a lot of phoneme grapheme analysis happening in that region, and it is very important, again, that the text we put in front of students allows that work to occur. We also have the inferior frontal gyrus, and a gyrus is just a ridge or a fold in the cerebellum. We have lots of them in our brain. This one is what is in charge of articulation. So you might also hear it called Broca's area. So it tells your mouth and your tongue and your lips and your teeth what to do in order to get those words that you read off of the page, as well as the superior temporal gyrus, also known as Wernicke's area. And this is really where meaning and comprehension is going to be playing a role as well. I don't know if you guys can hear or not, but the sirens are going off again. So there's a lot of wind and rain, but I think we'll be okay. Okay, so a little research overview here. There are three main research studies that I really feel give a good overview of the importance of decodable text. So the first is from 1985, and it was one of the first studies that was really done on decodable text. And it was with first grade students, and these first grade students read two different types of text. So one was more of a basal reader and one was a basal reader that was more focused on phonics. And what the researchers found was that both phonics instruction and the type of text significantly shape early word recognition skills. So when students were given text that asked them to think about decoding, their word recognition skills improved because they were having to use them and develop them and work that part of their brain. So it's really important that we're giving students the opportunity to do this. The second study is about decodables and EL students. And sometimes you'll hear people say that decodables are not good for EL students because EL students need more experience with language. Well, the truth is that phonics, in addition to decodable text, better supported English learners' reading and English development than phonics alone, especially decodables that were very meaningful to those students. The last study that I want to talk about is from 2007. And what I like about this study is it found that the use of decodable text enhances the application of phonics skills. And this was my favorite part, increases students' confidence. So when students were given decodable text, what they found was that they started to rely less on appealing to the teacher for help with those words because the student found that they have the skills they needed to decode them. So here are some things that you might think, or maybe that you've heard others say about decodable text. But decodable texts are boring. The truth is, they don't have to be. Here is another example from La Prea's Developing Decoders about skunks. And what an interesting topic for lots of kids that would want to learn how to read about skunks, right? So they're not just reading repetitive sentences or reading words that do not make sense, but they're reading about real life topics. But decodable text are harder. Well, that might be true, but this is a good thing. So traditionally, we would give some of our earliest readers pattern books that were predictable, right? And our students would find success with them because they were just word calling and memorizing a short sentence and saying, the dog is happy, the dog is sad, the dog is mad. Well, that didn't work the pathway in their brain that was facilitating orthographic mapping. So, yes, in the moment, it was easier. But over time, what happens is they don't have the skills that they need in order to actually read. And so over years and over time, it becomes a detriment to them. That early success was not really success. So this is an example from Developing Decoders that's practicing that CK grapheme. And so students are getting lots of different opportunities to read it in a meaningful way. They have names, Mac and Nick. They have nouns, rock and puck. So you can have great conversations and comprehension about that text. But decodable language isn't natural. And that can be true, especially for beginning decodables. But I would argue that's true for beginning leveled readers as well, right? When we put those predictable texts, those level A, B, C's books in front of kids, that's not how we talk. We don't say the same sentence over and over. Decodable language will improve as the scope and sequence progresses. So by the time you're getting towards the end of your scope and sequence, you're not going to be able to tell a decodable book apart from a level text, other than that it might have a greater incidence of words that match that particular phonics pattern that is being learned. So this is a book from the Developing Decoders that is focusing on baseball. So when I read this book, it sounds very natural. I would not know that this is a decodable text unless I was really paying attention to those phonics skills. But kids don't like decodables, if you've ever heard that. And I would say, just like with any book, they just haven't read the right decodable yet. Like, look at this one. It has a frog that is actively being eaten by a snake. Like, what second grade boy wouldn't want to read this book, right? Um, we have lots and lots of decodable text to choose from. And honestly, students really like them. They like feeling successful, but they also just like the books themselves. They don't know that it's a decodable text or level text. They just see a book that they want to read. In my district last year, we rolled out the use of decodable text in second and third grade, and we asked all of our teachers to use them with their students in small group who needed more support with specific phonics skills based on a diagnostic that we had given. And I had teachers coming up to me and saying, hey, I have some of my higher groups that are really jealous that they don't get to read those decodables. Is it okay if they read them too? It's like, yes, absolutely. So kids like the books. So, another opportunity to stop and jot for just a moment. A colleague questions why you are using a decodable with your students. How do you respond in 1 minute or less? So, I'll give you about a minute to write this down, and then if you'd like to share out afterwards, you can. About 30 more seconds, and then we can share out. Hey, I see some great reasons here in the chat. Gives them practice with reading patterns that they've learned. Yes, they really need that. It's Blevins talks about decodable text like being the training wheels that kids need for that decoding practice. Students have learned the skills necessary to read the book successfully. Yes, absolutely. I love that, Janet. I want to give them the opportunity to build the brain pathways that are essential to decoding and will lead to automaticity. Yes, very much agreed, Mary. Increases students' confidence. I want my students to be able to practice the skill they are currently learning and feel successful while reading. Yes, you guys are leading me right into our next topic where we're going to talk about the joy of decodable text. Those are fantastic reasons. I would agree with all of them that the decodables that we're putting in front of students can really help with their confidence, can help with their phonics practice, all of the above. All right. Is my screen still sharing? Yes, you can still see it. Okay.
Yes, yes, it's still sharing.
Okay, perfect. I have, it says that it's paused. Can you see if you give a mouse a cookie?
No, not yet. We're still on stop and jot.
That's what I thought. It's disappeared again. Okay, what
Oh,
about now?
no, yep, there it is.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is just a quick literature connection. If you do have colleagues that or are hesitant about using decodable text, or even parents that are hesitant, this kind of cause and effect line of conversation can be helpful. And I like to tie it back to the very popular "If You Give a Mouse a Cookie" by Laura Numeroff, because it's something that many educators can understand. So, if you give a student decodable text, they will practice decoding words by mapping sound spelling correspondences, right? If we give those words to our students in the form of a text, it's going to be in front of them and they're going to have to do that orthographic mapping process. When students practice decoding words, they begin to orthographically map words into their long-term memory. As students orthographically map more words, word recognition skills improve and fluency begins to develop. As fluency increases, students have cognitive resources to focus on understanding the text. So, this kind of addresses another common pushback that I will hear about decodables. But what about comprehension? But what about vocabulary? Yes, we want to focus on all strands of the reading rope. Absolutely. And decodable text allow us to do that in a meaningful way and to set students up for success. We'll talk about how you can focus on vocabulary and comprehension with decodable text, even your earlier ones. But it's important to know that, again, these are training wheels that we're giving to our students so that they can decode any text in front of them and have the cognitive resources to be able to understand deep levels of comprehension. So let's talk about the joy of decodable text. Decodable texts provide confidence. So, this was a research study not about reading specifically, but about motivation. And it said of all the factors that have been studied, the strongest known force in daily motivation is a sense of progress. And this really does have connections to decodable text because students are going to have the opportunity to apply what they've learned in a phonics lesson. If we give students books that are not connected to the skills that they've already learned, then it is not they don't have that same sense of progress. Decodable text instill independence. So we talked about this earlier with the study by Mesmer, but students will grow out of the habit of appealing for all unknown words because they will learn that they can decode the words in the text. So if we give students that they know every time they come across a word, it's going to be in their reading bag of tricks that they're going to know how to decode that. That's going to be the strategy that they go to. If there are texts where there are high amounts of uncontrolled words, then they're going to learn to ask because they don't have the skills they need to attack that word. Decodable texts support progress. So level texts do not always equate to grade level skills. Students will be able to apply learned phonics skills at a quicker rate with connected text. So sometimes, especially in the earlier grades, you can pull a level text for first grade that has R-controlled vowels and vowel teams. And those students might have just completed a lesson on silent E. And then there's a huge disconnect. And so students aren't seeing that progress. They're really successful in their phonics lesson, but then they're not able to transfer that to the books that they're reading. So decodable text can give them that feeling of progress. So I wanted to ask if you guys had any other things that you would add to that list. What other joyful benefits have you seen of decodable text in action? We have about 10 more seconds if anyone has anything they want to stick in the chat. Okay. Okay, so we're going to end by talking about some strategies for using decodable text. And this is evaluative criteria, and there's three of them that are generally recommended when you're thinking about text that you want to put in front of your students. Three things to think through. First, is it comprehensible? So you're able to look at the book and say, this makes sense. Second, is it instructive? I can read these words. That's what we want our students to say. So that's where it's very important that as educators, we're thinking through the scope and sequence that we're teaching with Tier 1 instruction and aligning our decodable text to that. Finally, is the text engaging? So we want students to look at the book and say, this is a good book. And there are so many options for decodable text today that you can find multiple texts that are going to have all three of these evaluative criterias. This is a quote and image from Wiley Blevin's book, Differentiating Phonics Instruction for Maximum Practice. He states decodables must be used for more than just phonics practice. So as decodables are becoming more and more prevalent in our primary classrooms, which is a very good thing, we want to make sure that we are strengthening all areas of the reading rope. So decodable text can be used for phonics application, but they can also be used to strengthen vocabulary and oral language. They can be used to teach comprehension and early reading behaviors. They can be used to teach writing and spelling, syntax and text cohesion, and they can be utilized for building fluency. So when we're thinking about using our decodable text, it's not just reading and thinking about the words, it's all of those layers. This also comes from Blevins. He has a pretty simple decodable text instructional routine. So before reading, that's where you have the opportunity to explicitly teach that new phonics skill, the new high frequency words, and important academic vocabulary. So sometimes your decodable text might be lining up with your tier 1 phonics instruction and just providing more practice for those students. Sometimes you might be using a diagnostic and figuring out where students have gaps and going back to their gap, providing that explicit teaching of that skill, and then using a decodable as a method for practice. During reading, you're going to read the book. Students, rather, are going to read the book, and you are going to provide corrective feedback and check in on students' understanding. After reading, that's where you're going to have those comprehension conversations. Students will make connections. You can reinforce vocabulary and give students opportunities to write to respond and reread. So none of these things are going to seem different than things that you might have done previously in guided reading. These are all the same things. We're still doing vocabulary. We're still having students read with check-ins and feedback. We're still having them do written responses. All of those things are good teaching. The main thing that's different or might be different is the text selection. And again, just making sure that it's aligned to that scope and sequence. Another thing that I have learned that was really an aha moment for me is when you're teaching vocabulary with decodables, especially decodables that are earlier in the scope and sequence, you are not limited to choosing vocabulary that is in the text. Instead, you can choose an academic word about the text, teach its meaning, and discuss it after reading the text. So, for example, this is a wonderful decodable from the Developing Decoder series, and it's for very early readers. And it says, is this a map? Yes. And then you can see this map over here, a pen. This is a map and a pen. Very engaging pictures, very controlled text for students to have that practice opportunity, but not a lot of rich vocabulary because they're not ready to decode it yet, right? So what you can do is think, well, when students are using maps, what might be a tier 2 vocabulary word that we could pull from that text? And one I thought of was navigate. So you can have that conversation with students. We're going to read this book about maps. Let's talk about the word navigate. And when teaching vocabulary, there's 4 steps that I like to follow. The first is to provide a definition. So I will even use ChatGPT for this, and I'll put in the word to ChatGPT and I will say, please give me a definition of navigate for first grade students. And it does a pretty good job. So navigate means to find out how to get somewhere. Then I like to connect it. So thinking about something in the student's everyday life that they can connect that word to. So I might say, you navigate the halls when you are called to the office. And then I relate it to the book. So in this book, there are many types of maps that help you navigate. And then finally, I give them an opportunity to put it in their own words. So at the small group table, I just do a very quick turn and talk. Turn and tell your partner what the word navigate means. So that's allowing them to not only have that input, but that expressive output as well when thinking about this vocabulary. So let's try it. I have a text here, and it is a book that is about pals. And this page says, you can do a lot with a pal. So again, from Developing Decoders, and you see those wonderful photographs, the wonderful controlled text, but there is nothing on this page that would immediately be like, that's a great tier two word. You could certainly talk about pal, but there might be some other higher level words that you could talk about as well. So take just a minute to jot down a word or stick it in the chat of words that you might use about that text. Friendship, cooperation. Yes, that cooperation was one that I thought of too. That's such a great one to talk to kids about. Relationship, yes. Friend, peer, absolutely. So those are words, all of those words would not yet be decodable, right? But they're so important for kids to know. So you can talk about those higher level tier two vocabulary words in context of even the simplest decodable text. Okay, so I wanted to end with the link to the Developing Decoders website. There's always new decodables that are coming out that, again, are aligned to the U-Fly scope and sequence. There's also one that was just written that's aligned to the foundation scope and sequence. So you can think through what your needs are for Tier 1 and align that to the decodables that you're putting in front of your students. And that ends my presentation. So I have some time for questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I just encourage people to put their questions in. I mean, I think one thing that, it's not a question, but one thing I appreciate about this presentation is extending the uses of decodable text, how you can build in vocabulary and comprehension, background knowledge, all the things that are on both strands, both domains on the reading rope. And I think, the more is something that's really being emphasized more these days than it has been in the past, that the most successful instruction is when we don't teach those individual skills in silos, but we integrate them because they're all related. And that's where we want our kids to end up to be, thinking about all those things in the language strands as well as building their word recognition skills. We want them to be doing that all together, all coordinated with each other. So I appreciate that you have that in this presentation, because it's I think that's sometimes when, for so many years in a lot of schools, there was no real emphasis on structured teaching of word recognition using phonics. And when we started to do that, I think a lot of us had a tendency to just do that, and just focus on that because that's what had been missing. But really what we need to do is do that plus all the other things that we need to impart to the kids. So I appreciate that. I
I
see
see
Brittany
Britt.
agrees.
Yes,
Thank you,
that's
Brittany.
exactly what
Thank
I
you,
was
Brittany.
saying.
would you say about, okay, after attending a recent conference, okay, all the new curriculum materials were overwhelming. How to choose the decodable to use um, if your school district is looking to purchase? Okay, so we can get into this, Lindsay, but I think the thing that Lindsay might say first is to look at um, whatever you've chosen for your basic instructional materials, get the scope and sequence out. It's in there somewhere in the teacher guide or the introduction materials. Get that scope and sequence out, and then start looking from there, right? I mean, all the good, none of your, it, there are many different scopes and sequences that are all probably equally valid. They don't vary that much. If you look at them, they go from simple to complex and common to more rare sound symbol correspondences. So, there'll be some variances between from scope and sequence in one program to scope and sequence in another. But what would you say, Lindsay, about how we go about? Maybe you even want to look within the instructional program that you're considering choosing, check within there first to see what they have for decodable text, and then see how easy would it be to find additional decodable texts that also match that scope and sequence.
Yes, that's exactly what I would say. And the process that I followed when we were purchasing decodable text for my district just last year is we looked at that tier one scope and sequence and looked for texts that were aligned with that, and then helped teachers because it can be overwhelming. And it is such a buzzword. And so that is one of the misconceptions I saw the most in my district when we made that shift is they would go to the decodable text library and they would pull out a bag of decodable text that looked interesting. And then they would say, my kid can't read this. You said it was decodable. Well, yes, but let's look at where they're at in their progression of phonics skills. So I think both things are important, making sure it aligns with scope and sequence. And then when you're providing that small group instruction, looking at individual student diagnostic assessments to figure out if they have any previous phonics gaps that are going to prevent them from being successful at that tier one level of instruction.
Do you have some suggestions when you're just, say you're not even at the point yet where you're looking for supplemental decodable readers that you could use with your tier one instructional program, but you're looking for a tier one instructional program and trying to decide what's going to be best for my students. Do you have any suggestions about looking at the type of text that they provide in the tier one program for practice, both the type of text and the amount of text?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know about Wisconsin, but I know in Missouri, we are our state is becoming more vocal about programs that they are wanting school districts to choose. So I think and really where I land is that the program itself is not what makes the difference. What makes the difference is the teacher and empowering teachers to have the knowledge so that whatever program you put in front of them, they understand the why and they know how to leverage that. Because so many of these programs, there's just so much to them that they're not understanding the why and the how and the when. And so I don't know if that answered your question because I am not recommending a certain program, but I think thinking through how are you going to set your teachers up for success with that program and thinking through the research that the program provides when you're making that decision as well.
Cynthia just put in a great comment in the chat, and it just, you always have to stop and think when you're talking about looking at tier one programs. Um, they may have, for some of your students, there may be enough text reading right in the program. You don't even need anything more, right? But kids' needs vary so much. And my experience in reading is on the tutoring level dealing with kids who have dyslexia, who probably need the most practice and repetition in reading. And very often a tier one program is not going to have anywhere near the amount of text that they need unless they're going to keep reading the same thing over and over and over, which is not very exciting. So I like Cynthia's idea, taking a number of different decodable sets and then take out the table of the scope and sequence for your tier one program, and then make a some kind of a chart that says for each set, which one of these books where do they fit in your scope and sequence. So one set of decodables only might only apply to things that come very early in your scope and sequence, and others might be clustered around things that happen later in your scope and sequence. A lot of decodable sets end after a lot of them end after teaching short vowels and closed syllables. That's all. Then that's the end of the decodable set, and they're just meant for that purpose, and they're great for that purpose. But you need something as you go on. The value of having kids practice with decodable text at the more advanced phonics levels, I think, is sometimes underrated, particularly with the kids who are starting to struggle. Some kids will just, they'll latch onto it and they'll be fine. But I think looking at it, that's one nice thing about the decodable sets that are available now, is you can go quite far in a scope and sequence. So can you speak to, in this sequence, Lindsey, how far would the La Brea decodable sets go in a scope and sequence? Where would they go up to? Would they, some stop at short vowels, some go through silent E and stop there, and others go on and do vowel teams and are controlled and the whole gamut. So some even go into prefixes and suffixes, right? So
Yeah.
where does the La Brea set fit in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the developing decoders go all the way through all of UFly's phonics skills. So, when you get towards the end, it's some very complex phonics skills, as well as prefixes and suffixes. So, the series that I'm really excited about that I'm working on right now is aligned to UFly, and it's all nonfiction. And so, it starts at the beginning and goes all the way through the end. And to Cynthia's point, where she talked about how different students need different amount of text, I think that will be another thing that's really helpful with this particular series is we've written a kindergarten scope and well, not scope and sequence, but a kindergarten series that only has one sentence of text per page for any skill that UFly teaches in kindergarten. A first grade series that has 1 to 2 sentences, and then a second grade series that starts with 1 to 2 and then moves to 3 to 5 sentences. So not only are you thinking through where they're at in their phonics progression, but you're also thinking about that level of text and concepts of print and all of those things that certainly impact the cognitive load as well.
Yeah, and I think just the stamina factor, right? So some kids, if they get a book and it's 20 pages long, they're going to glaze over and they don't even want to start. But, so there is some advantage to having nice short little texts, sometimes not even in books, just like paragraph selections, and then you're done. But for other students, they can handle more extensive text. The other thing that I keep thinking about with decodable text is the early sets seem to be just narrative. They usually were about, I don't know, kids or animals or a combination of the two, and the stories were kind of silly, honestly, but they were just narrative stories. And what I like about some of the sets that are coming out now is that they're a mixture of narrative stories and nonfiction, like what you're working on now. And all of our s- ever since the Common Core standards came out anyway, there's been a big emphasis on increasing the percentage of time that kids spend with informative text versus narrative text. Not that narrative text should be set aside, but we had been shortchanging the informative text where they can actually build more background knowledge and a certain type of vocabulary. Narrative text builds a different kind of vocabulary, so they both have their place, but it's nice now to see, and some kids are just drawn more toward informative text also, while other kids, oh, I like the stories. So I think that's another thing to look for when you're looking for something that might be a good match for your students. What about kids who are, one of the problems that I always had working with kids who were dyslexic, I would get kids who were juniors in high school who were reading on a second grade level. And that was always very difficult for me to find decodable text that wasn't too babyish, that, would give them the practice they need, but it would be appropriate for their biological age, not their reading level. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is that getting any better these days?
I just had a conversation not too long ago with the sped department at our high school, and they had that exact same question. And to some extent, I don't think there's any getting around that because if you have a high school student that's only able to read short vowels, they're very aware of that and they know that the text that you put in front of them looks different than their peers. But what I told them was, I think the payoff is worth it because they will find success, and that success will lead to motivation that's going to kind of get that momentum rolling. And at the same time, I do think there's a lot more options out there. There are some decodable text series that are written more towards the middle school, high school. There is one that we found that was about, it was a series of a girl that was learning how to date and all of that. And so that was maybe a little more engaging. I think that's again where nonfiction comes in really helpful because learning about snakes is not necessarily a primary K2 concept that could be of an interest to a high school student too. So there's lots of things to think about with that, but I think it's still an issue that high school teachers are facing.
Yeah. So Cynthia suggested the high interest, low level readers, and they are great for kids, at least when they get to a certain level. I think some of the high noon little chapter books, I've had good luck with high school students because they look like chapter books. They're like little paperbacks, and they don't look so babyish. And yes, the phonic readers or whatever phonic books from the UK. Um, I think they're Moondog. They have a bunch of different series, and I think Moondogs is one that appeals to the older kids.
I think
Um,
that was the one that was about the dating.
yeah,
That
I wouldn't be
sounds familiar.
surprised. Yeah,
Hmm.
and oh, thanks for putting the link in, Lisa, because yeah, the Moondog series is pretty good. At our local library, where we do have a section of decodable readers, our public library for kids to come in and with their parents and find something that's at their level. Um, they the librarians have purposely taken the Moondog series and one other series that they have, and they don't put them in that section. They put them over with the adolescent reader section, because that way they don't feel like they're in the baby section. Another thing that I did when there weren't too many things available is sometimes I would take text that was in a decodable reader, but one of the things that was really objectionable to the older kids is that they were all illustrated with these very baby looking, and I would just retype them out on a plain piece of paper, so that there were no illustrations at all. And then it's more, sometimes it feels a little more age appropriate. There is an online company, I think out of Australia, SPELD spelled. And I believe if you go there, um, I'm pretty sure that's the one where they have a bunch of decodable readers at different levels, but you can print them off with or without pictures, which is kind of nice. So yeah, it's always, the what we have to remember is that if they're it doesn't matter how old they are, if they're a second grade level or a first grade level, they're at that level. And if you want them to move forward, you have to get them through that level and push them forward, right? So it's not like they can just skip over, like, oh, I really like these decodables. Look at this, they're much more interesting because they have R controlled and they have multisyllabic words and they've got all the vowel teams, and that's great, except if they can't read them, it's just going to be counterproductive.
Very true.
So
I've also seen there's a website that will generate decodables for you aligned to certain scope and sequences. It's free. Sometimes the decodables it gives you are not the best, but what's nice about it is you can put in student names. And so for some of my striving reluctant readers, will write a decodable that has their name in it. So that can be kind of a strategy that you can use too. I wouldn't rely on it as your only strategy because I think it's important for them to have books in their hands too, but as something you can go back and forth between.
thank you, Cynthia, for putting the SPELD link in the chat. Before I forget, I'm going to go back and pull out of the chat the link to the certificate of attendance. Sometimes I forget about that when I get involved in conversation. Um, Oops, that's the wrong one. You go back here and copy this. I want you to be able to get your certificate if you need one. Okay, so I just posted in the chat the link that you can use to request a certificate of attendance if you need one. We also had, go back and get the link that Lindsay gave us for her slide deck. Thank you very much, Lindsay, because I know how people always like to have access to slides. Um, so thank you for that. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I just want to thank Lindsay for taking time, and especially during the climate crisis in Missouri. I hope that the rest of your evening is safe down there. And for the rest of us, I'm hoping that people have either already voted early or they're planning to go to the polls tomorrow. So I just always want to encourage people to get out there and vote. That's one of the things that makes our country great. So regardless of where your leanings are, I think that's important to put that in your schedule and make sure it gets done by tomorrow. Anything else, Lindsay? Any parting words?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you all today. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll see everybody, maybe see some of you Wisconsinites on our Teachers Lounge at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. And, keep an eye out on our social media for our new events. The next one of these that we're doing is in January 27th, and that's with Anna Geiger. We'll be discussing her new book, Reaching All Readers. So she's the Measured Mom, in case you don't know her by her real name, but she has the Measured Mom website, and she has the Triple R podcast series. So that'll be our next one, but feel free to join us on Saturday for our Teachers Lounge. So with that, I'm going to let everybody go, and have a great evening and have a great rest of your week in school. Thank you.